There is a single, often overlooked line hidden inside Genesis 6 that can change the way we read the flood, not merely as cosmic punishment for moral failure, but as a targeted corrective act against a breach between heaven and earth. That secret verse is the hinge of an argument that, taken in its earliest linguistic and cultural light, suggests the flood responds to more than human wickedness. It answers a boundary crossing that threatened what it means to be human. What follows is a careful walk through the Hebrew text, ancient interpretation, Near Eastern parallels, and the theological implications that flow from this reading. If you want the full deep dive into ancient texts and archaeology, subscribe now. Genesis 6:1-4 is short and famously puzzling. It tells us that when human beings began to multiply, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful and took them as wives. The result, the text says, was the Nephilim, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Genesis 6:1-4. A few verses later, God laments human wickedness and decides to send the flood. Genesis 6:5-7. On the surface, the narrative moves quickly from social corruption to divine judgment. Yet the wording and a few key Hebrew expressions embedded in that passage invite a different emphasis. Two Hebrew phrases sit at the center of the dispute, and therefore at the heart of the secret verse. The first is Bene Elohim, sons of God, and the second is Nephilim, traditionally translated giants or fallen ones. Bene Elohim appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, in contexts that help us read it. Job 1.6 and 2:1 describe the Bene Elohim presenting themselves before the Lord, language that seems to refer to divine beings. Job 38.7 pictures the morning stars and the sons of God shouting for joy at creation. These usages suggest that Bene Elohim is not an ordinary human designation, but points to a class of heavenly beings. The word Nephilim is trickier. Its root nephal can mean to fall, giving rise to possible translations like fallen ones, but the Septuagint and later translators often render it giants, and ancient reception connects the Nephilim with great, often violent figures. Taken together, Genesis 6:1-4 can be read as saying that divine beings had relations with human women, producing an anomalous hybrid population whose presence correlates with the moral and social breakdown that follows. Not everyone reads the passage this way, and we must recognize interpretive alternatives. For centuries, the dominant ecclesiastical explanation in parts of Christendom recast Bene Elohim as sons of God in a purely human sense, descendants of Seth, while daughters of men became descendants of Cain. This Sethite reading removes supernatural intercourse from the account and turns the story into a warning against intermarriage with ungodly lines. Medieval and later rationalizing tendencies favored this interpretation because it avoided the theological difficulties posed by angels mating with humans. It also fit a pastoral desire to domesticate the mystery into moral instruction about mixed loyalties. But the ancient evidence complicates the Sethite reconstruction. The broader biblical corpus and Second Temple literature preserve a reading that treats Genesis 6 as describing an otherworldly intrusion. Jude, a short New Testament letter, explicitly references angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling, and connects this with sexual immorality and judgment. Jude 1:6-7. Peter, in his epistles, refers to angels punished and confined in darkness. 2 Peter 2:4. Compare 1 Peter 3:19-20 in some readings. These brief New Testament allusions do not reconstruct the whole myth, but they do show that early Jewish and Christian interpreters understood Genesis 6 in supernatural terms. That interpretive thread becomes much thicker once we turn to the Book of Enoch and other intertestamental writings. The Book of Enoch, an extra-biblical work preserved most fully in Ethiopic and known in fragments elsewhere, supplies the narrative details that Genesis leaves elliptical. Enoch paints a picture of a group called the Watchers, 200 angels led by figures like Semjaza, who descended to Mount Hermon, made a pact to take human wives, and taught forbidden arts, metallurgy, astrology, enchantments, and warcraft. The offspring of these unions are described as giants who consume what is produced by humans, become violent, and even turn to cannibalism in some traditions. Enoch blames the Watchers for corrupting humanity not only morally, but ontologically. They introduce knowledge and mixed bloodlines that upset the created order. The result, in Enoch, is so grave that God decides to cleanse the earth, an action that culminates in the flood. It is crucial to stress that Enoch is not canonical scripture for most Jewish and Christian traditions. It is, however, an influential witness to how many ancient readers understood Genesis 6. Where Genesis says little, Enoch supplies a dramatic narrative that preserves an interpretive tradition. The flood functions, at least in part, as a purge of illicit celestial human mixing. How should we evaluate Enoch's contribution? One must treat it as interpretive expansion, not as replacement for Genesis. But it is significant that early Jewish thinkers and some early Christians preserved Enochic themes. Jude cites Enoch explicitly, Jude 1:14-15, and the concern with angels and their transgression runs through several intertestamental texts. These traditions provide a consistent ancient voice that reads Genesis 6 as describing an ontological breach, divine beings stepping into the human world in a way that produced hybrid offspring and introduced dangerous technologies and knowledge. Linguistics and close reading support this vector of interpretation. The phrase, "in those days," followed by, "and also afterwards" in Genesis 6:4, creates continuity between the pre-flood population and later incidences of giants in the Promised Land. The presence of the Nephilim, in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, suggests continuity. The disruptive hybrid line was not simply a passing phenomenon, but had consequences that echoed into the post-flood world. This ties neatly to other biblical witnesses. The Anakim, mentioned in the wanderings of Israel and the conquest narratives, Numbers 13-14, Deuteronomy 2-3, and the Philistine giant Goliath, 1 Samuel 17, who appears as a later example of residual monstrous strength against God's people. If Genesis 6 introduces an ontological contamination, the narratives of Numbers, Joshua, and Samuel show how such contamination can survive or re-emerge and present theological reasons for the severe commands given to Israel in conquest contexts. It is also vital to note the phrase that describes Noah in the immediate lead-up to the flood. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Genesis 6:9. The Hebrew phrase, tamim bidorotav, can be read morally. Noah was morally blameless, or genealogically. Noah was blameless in his generations, perhaps indicating that he remained within an uncontaminated line. Both senses are possible and compatible. The subtlety of the Hebrew invites us to see Noah, not only as morally upright, but as someone whose lineage preserved covenantal integrity. If the flood is at least partly a corrective against a corrupted lineage, Noah's selection gains an additional layer of meaning. God chooses the vessel through which the covenantal human project, untarnished by illicit mixtures, will continue. This reading also finds resonance in the larger ancient Near Eastern world. Mesopotamian literature knows of beings who bridge the divine and the human. The Apkallu, for example, are semi-divine sages sent to teach humanity skills like writing and craft. Some accounts depict them as fish-cloaked figures or as transmitted wisdom bearers, and royal inscriptions often celebrate kings as having divine ancestry or being chosen by gods. Gilgamesh in the epic is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid whose monstrous aspects and his eventual quest for meaning mirror the problematic figure of the Nephilim. Where Mesopotamian kings claim or are given divine descent as a political advantage, Genesis seems to be subverting that model by turning divine-human mixing into a source of disorder and judgment. Rather than affirming divine kingship as legitimate, the Genesis account, especially when read with Enochic elaboration, presents such mixing as a transgression that requires correction. Archaeology and iconography supply echoes rather than proof. Reliefs and royal inscriptions display rulers with divine attributes, and myths of hybrid creatures circulate widely in the ancient Near East. These parallels do not demonstrate that angels mated with humans as a biological operation. Nor do they prove Enochic claims. They show that ancient cultures shared motifs about boundary crossers, figures who blur the line between gods and men, and that Genesis participates in a conversation with that cultural environment. Genesis, depending on the reading, either absorbs and redeploys these motifs or stands in polemic against them. Either way, the flood narrative functions as a decisive theological statement about the dangers of unlawful intimacy between heaven and earth. What about the ethical and social consequences? Extra-biblical narratives often attribute to the Nephilim a kind of hyper-violence and predatory rule. Enoch, and later rabbinic expansions, depict giants who devour humanity's produce, kill for sport, and introduce crimes beyond mere theft, sometimes rising to cannibalism or terrifying tyranny. Whether literal or symbolic, these portrayals underscore a cultural anxiety. Hybrid rulers or beings, empowered by illicit knowledge, upset social order and prey upon ordinary human communities. If the flood is read as a response to that kind of systemic corruption, then it becomes not only a moral reset, but a structural intervention designed to preserve the created distinction between creator and creature. This interpretation also casts the hard commands in the Book of Joshua and other conquest narratives in a different light. When Israel is instructed to drive out and, in some cases, utterly destroy certain populations, e.g. the Anakim in Numbers and Joshua, the concern may not be merely ethnic or political but theological, removing residual strains of the prior contamination that could reintroduce the structures that led to catastrophe. This is a delicate argument to make, and it must be handled with caution. The biblical texts themselves frame conquest in covenantal, territorial, and cultic language. Reading them through the Genesis 6 lens helps explain the theological intensity behind such commands, but does not allow us to read contemporary policies or ethical stances back into ancient narratives. Turning to the New Testament, Jude and 2 Peter provide shorthand confirmations that some early readers saw Genesis 6 as describing angelic rebellion and sexual transgression. Jude's reference to angels who left their own habitation, and to Sodom and Gomorrah as examples of sexual immorality, ties Genesis 6 to a broader typology of divine punishment for boundary transgression, Jude 1:6-7. Peter's mention of angels handed over to chains of gloomy darkness for judgment, 2 Peter 2:4, echoes the Enochic motif of angelic restraint. Again, these passages do not reconstruct Enoch in full detail, but they do demonstrate that the supernatural reading of Genesis 6 had traction in early Jewish Christian thought. At this point, it is worth pausing and offering two explicit caveats. First, nothing in this argument should be taken to mean that angels have biological bodies like humans in a modern scientific sense, nor that the biblical authors intended to provide anatomical accounts. The language of descent and offspring belongs to ancient idiom, and interpreters must avoid translating that idiom into contemporary biological frameworks without qualification. Second, the Book of Enoch, while valuable for understanding how some ancient communities read Genesis, is extra-canonical for most traditions and should be treated as influential interpretation rather than scripture itself. With those cautions in place, the secret verse in Genesis 6 begins to look less like an isolated curiosity and more like a key that unlocks a consistent interpretive trajectory. Reading Bene Elohim as divine beings, Nephilim as their extraordinary offspring, and noting the textual links to Job, Jude, and 2 Peter, we find a coherent ancient conception. The flood functions partly to remove an ontological contamination, a hybridization that threatened human identity and order. Noah, blameless in his generation, becomes the starting point for renewed humanity precisely because his line preserves the boundary that had been transgressed. Why does this matter for us today? Two connected reasons. First, it shapes the theological reading of judgment and redemption. If God's judgment in the flood addresses not only moral depravity, but also an ontological trespass, then redemption must include the restoration of proper boundaries between creator and creature. The narrative warns against the seductive claim that crossing divine limits, whether by illicit intimacy with divine powers, or by arrogating divine prerogatives through technologies, will yield flourishing. Instead, such crossings can engender forms of domination that harm the vulnerable and degrade communal life. Second, the Genesis 6 motif resonates powerfully with contemporary anxieties about boundary crossing in other forms. Today, the border we most often discuss is genetic, transhumanism, gene editing, and technologies that propose to enhance or alter human capacities in unprecedented ways. The ancient story is not a direct blueprint for modern bioethics, but it functions as typological warning. Humanity's attempt to redefine what it means to be human by adopting forbidden knowledge or altering fundamental boundaries risks unforeseen social and moral consequences. Jesus' warning that the days before his return will be as the days of Noah, Matthew 24-37-39, invites reflection on patterns, not identical events. The pattern is boundary violation, followed by chaotic consequences, followed by divine intervention in history. How that pattern manifests in our age may look different, but the underlying theological concern, respecting created limits and guarding against forms of domination born from illicit power, remains pertinent. Of course, not all readers will accept the supernatural reading, and scholarship remains divided. Philologists, textual critics, and theologians continue to debate the meaning of Bene Elohim, the semantic range of Nephilim, and the weight to give to extra-biblical traditions. Some scholars emphasize social, literary, or theological explanations that do not require angelic agency. Others point to the patchwork transmission history of Genesis and to redactional layers that complicate a single, neat reconstruction. This account does not claim absolute proof. It offers one reading, anchored in the Hebrew terms, early interpretation, and ancient Near Eastern context, that gives the flood a dimension too often overlooked: the preservation of human ontology against an illicit hybridization that endangered the image of God. To summarize the line of reasoning, Genesis 6:1-4 contains language, the Ben Elohim and the Nephilim, that when read against Job and Second Temple literature, coheres with a tradition that saw the flood as corrective against divine human mixtures. Enoch and related writings expand that tradition, depicting watchers who taught forbidden arts and engendered giants whose violence and domination precipitated divine judgment. Mesopotamian myths provide cultural parallels of semi-divine rulers and boundary crossers, while biblical post-flood narratives of giants and the hard commands in conquest literature can be read as continuations of the struggle against residual contamination. New Testament references to angelic judgment corroborate that this reading was present in early Christian thought. Taken together, these strands make the secret verse, the brief cryptic lines of Genesis 6, an interpretive key for understanding the flood as both moral and ontological correction. The implications are sobering. The ancient page invites us to ask how we treat knowledge and power today, and whether our age's experiments with human enhancement, unchecked technological mastery, and self-deifying ambitions repeat a pattern the Bible already knew. That is not to enter into facile conspiracy, nor to assert that all innovation is suspect. Rather, it is to recognize a biblical principle. Crossing the boundary between creature and creator, whether by illicit intimacy or by presumptive mastery, has consequences that may be spiritual, moral, and social. If this reframes Genesis for you, reflect. Did these sons of God cross a line they shouldn't have? And what would it mean for us to heed the warning embedded in that ancient narrative? For those wanting to go deeper, the next installment will trace how early Christian writers wrestled with these traditions, and how the New Testament's brief references became the seedbed for centuries of theological reflection. Subscribe and comment. Tell us what you think. Is Genesis 6 a story about illicit heavenly intercourse, a warning about political theology wrapped in myth, or something else entirely? Share this with someone who loves ancient mysteries and careful biblical study, and join the conversation below.